Your mind isn't inside you. I know how that sounds. I know the immediate visceral reaction that sentence produces, because I had the same reaction the first time I really sat with it. It sounds like mysticism. It sounds like the kind of thing someone says at a dinner party after too much wine, gesturing vaguely at the cosmos. It sounds, frankly, unscientific. But here's the thing. It's not. It's not unscientific at all. In fact, the more carefully you look at what modern neuroscience, quantum mechanics, and the philosophy of mind actually say about consciousness, the more carefully you trace the argument from its foundations, the more you find that the assumption that your mind lives inside your skull is not a scientific conclusion. It's a habit. A deeply ingrained, almost impossible to question habit of thinking that we've inherited from centuries of intuition that may, when examined rigorously, turn out to be exactly wrong. And I want to be very precise about what I mean by exactly wrong, because there are two ways to be wrong about where your mind is. The first way, the mystical way, the way I'm not arguing, is to say your mind is somewhere else, in your heart, maybe, or in some ethereal realm beyond the physical. That's not what physics is pointing at. The second way, the way that's genuinely, rigorously, scientifically supported by the hardest problems in modern physics, is to say that the question, where is your mind, might be based on a false premise. That the concepts of inside and outside, of here and there, of spatial location itself might not apply to consciousness in the way we've been assuming, that the relationship between your experience and the physical world is so strange, so counterintuitive, so unlike what common sense suggests, that the very framework we use to ask the question is probably inadequate. That's the argument I want to make, and I want to make it carefully. Starting from the ground up, let's begin with what seems like solid ground. You have a brain. It's sitting inside your skull right now, roughly 3 pounds of tissue, about the consistency of firm tofu, consuming about 20 watts of power, roughly the same as a dim light bulb. It contains approximately 86 billion neurons, each one connected to thousands of others, forming a network of roughly 100 trillion synaptic connections. When you see a red apple, neurons in your visual cortex fire. When you feel pain, neurons in your somatosensory cortex and anterior cingulate cortex activate. When you feel fear, your amygdala lights up. When you form a memory, the hippocampus is involved. Brain damage in specific regions produces specific predictable deficits in experience and behavior. Drugs that alter neurotransmitter chemistry alter experience anesthesia, which chemically disrupts neural activity, eliminates experience entirely. The correlation between brain states and mental states is overwhelming. It's one of the best established findings in all of science. And from that correlation, the obvious conclusion, the one virtually everyone draws, including most scientists and philosophers, is that the brain produces consciousness, that your mind is what your brain does. That experience is a product of neural computation arising from the physical activity of neurons, and that it lives inside your skull because your neurons live inside your skull. This view has a name, physicalism, or sometimes materialism. The mind is physical. Consciousness is what sufficiently complex information processing feels like from the inside. Your experience of the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the what it's like to be you, all of it is generated by the brain, inside the brain, as a function of the brain. It's clean. It's intuitive. It fits the evidence, apparently. And it runs headlong into a problem so deep, so stubbornly resistant to solution, that the philosopher David Chalmers gave it a name that has stuck: the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem, when you really understand what it's saying, does something remarkable. It doesn't just challenge physicalism. It challenges the very notion that experience is the kind of thing that could, even in principle, be explained by pointing to physical processes inside a skull. Let me explain the hard problem carefully, because it's almost always mischaracterized. The easy problems of consciousness, Chalmers' term, not mine, and he's the first to admit they're not actually easy, are questions about the functions of consciousness. How does the brain integrate information from different sensory sources? How does it regulate attention? How does it produce behavior in response to experience? How does it form memories and use them to guide future actions? These are hard problems. In the ordinary scientific sense, they require enormous effort and ingenuity to investigate, but they're tractable. In principle, with enough neuroscience and enough computation, you could imagine explaining them. You'd end up with a very detailed account of how the brain processes information. The hard problem is different. The hard problem asks, why is there something it's like to be you? Why, when photons of a certain wavelength hit your retina and trigger a cascade of neural activity, is there a subjective experience of redness? Why does the information processing feel like anything at all? You can describe the neural correlates in as much detail as you like. This neuron fires, that signal propagates, this region of cortex activates, and at the end of that description, you've explained the information processing. But you haven't explained why it's accompanied by experience, why there's a what it's like, why the lights are on. That gap between the physical description and the subjective experience is the hard problem. And here's why it matters so much. Any explanation of consciousness that's purely in terms of physical processes faces this gap. You can describe the most complete, most detailed, most accurate physical story of a brain processing information, and someone can always coherently ask, yes, but why does that processing feel like anything? That question doesn't disappear no matter how detailed the physical description gets. And the fact that the question doesn't disappear, the fact that there seems to be a permanent, in-principle gap between physical description and experiential reality is what makes the hard problem hard. It's not a gap in our current knowledge that will be filled by more neuroscience. It's potentially a gap in the framework itself. A sign that the framework of third-person physical description, the framework of neurons and signals and information processing might be missing something fundamental about the nature of experience. And that missing something, many serious philosophers and physicists are arguing, might not live inside the brain. Let me introduce you to a thought experiment that has become one of the most discussed in the philosophy of mind. It's called Mary's Room, and it was devised by the philosopher Frank Jackson in 1982. I want to walk through it carefully because it captures something important about the relationship between physical knowledge and experience. Mary is a brilliant scientist who lives in a completely black and white room. She's never seen color, not because she's colorblind, but because her entire environment is black and white. Her food is black and white. Her screens are black and white. Her clothes are black and white. But Mary is a neuroscientist of extraordinary talent, and she has spent her entire life studying the science of color vision. She knows everything there is to know, physically, about color. She knows which wavelengths of light stimulate which cone cells in the retina. She knows exactly which neural pathways are activated when someone sees red. She knows the complete neural correlate of every color experience. She knows all the functional facts about color perception that any physical theory could ever deliver. Now, one day, Mary leaves the room. For the first time, she sees a red apple. Does she learn something new? Jackson's argument, and I find it compelling, though it's been contested, is yes, she learns what it's like to see red. She acquires knowledge that no amount of physical information, however complete, could have given her. She learns something about the qualitative character of experience, what philosophers call qualia, that was simply not capturable in any physical description. If that's right, if Mary learns something genuinely new, then physical facts don't exhaust all the facts. There are facts about experience that are over and above physical facts. And if that's true, then consciousness is not fully explained by anything inside Mary's brain or anyone's brain, because the brain is a physical system and physical facts alone don't tell the whole story. Now, you might be thinking, and this is a natural response, that Mary doesn't really learn anything new. She just gains a new ability. The ability to recognize red when she sees it. The ability to imagine red. But she doesn't gain new knowledge. She gains new competence. This response is called the ability hypothesis. And it's a serious philosophical position. But here's the problem. When Mary leaves the room, she doesn't just gain the ability to recognize red. She has an experience. There is something, it's like for her to see red for the first time. That experience, that qualia exists. It's real. It's happening. And asking what is not a question about abilities. It's a question about a fact of reality. And that fact, the redness of her red experience, is not in any of the physical descriptions she already possessed. Something is being left out. And what's being left out might be the most important thing. Now I want to take this further, because the hard problem, Mary's room, are starting points, not conclusions. What I really want to explore is what physics itself, not philosophy, not intuition, but the actual mathematics and experimental results of modern physics might be telling us about the relationship between mind and matter. And here's where things get genuinely strange. And I mean strange in the technical, precise, this is what the equations say sense. Quantum mechanics is our most fundamental and most successful theory of the physical world. It describes the behavior of matter and energy at the smallest scales: atoms, electrons, photons, quarks. Its predictions have been confirmed to a precision of better than 1 part in a billion. It is, by the standard of experimental confirmation, the most accurate theory in the history of science. And at its heart, quantum mechanics has a problem that has been debated since the 1920s and is extraordinarily still not resolved. The problem is called the measurement problem, and it goes like this. In quantum mechanics, physical systems don't have definite properties until they're measured. An electron doesn't have a definite position until you look for it. A photon's polarization is not vertical or horizontal. Until you measure it, it exists in a superposition of both possibilities simultaneously. The quantum state of a system, described mathematically by something called the wave function, evolves smoothly and deterministically, spreading out into superpositions of different possibilities, as long as you don't measure it. But when you measure, when you interact with the system in such a way as to extract information about it, the wave function apparently collapses. The superposition resolves into a single definite outcome. The electron is here, not there. The photon is vertical, not horizontal. What causes the collapse? Why does measurement produce a definite outcome? Why does the act of observation seem to play a special role in the physics, in the standard Copenhagen interpretation, the textbook version, the one taught in physics courses? The answer is essentially, don't ask. The wave function is a calculational tool. When you measure, you get an outcome with certain probabilities. That's the theory. The question of what really happens between measurements, or what causes collapse, is not a question physics can answer. But that's deeply unsatisfying. And many physicists have refused to accept it. And in exploring why the measurement seems to play a special role in trying to understand what observation and measurement actually mean physically, some of the most serious thinkers in the foundations of physics have arrived at a deeply uncomfortable possibility that consciousness might play a fundamental role in the physics of measurement. I want to be careful here, because this idea has been enormously abused. It's been hijacked by people selling quantum healing and consciousness-based pseudoscience of every variety. And I want to be very clear, what I'm about to describe is not that. It's a serious, mathematically precise, debated among physicists position. And even if it turns out to be wrong, it's wrong in an interesting and instructive way. The argument begins with John von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. In 1932, von Neumann published a rigorous mathematical treatment of quantum mechanics in which he traced the measurement problem with extraordinary care. He showed that if you tried to account for the measurement apparatus quantum mechanically treating the measuring device as a quantum system subject to Schrödinger's equation, then the measurement apparatus also enters a superposition. And if you then account for the experimenter's brain quantum mechanically, the brain also enters a superposition. The superposition doesn't collapse anywhere in the chain of physical causation. Von Neumann concluded that the chain had to be terminated somewhere, that there had to be something that stood outside the quantum mechanical description and caused the collapse. And the only candidate he could identify was consciousness itself. The conscious observer, in von Neumann's framework, is the point where the wave function collapses. And crucially, this is the point I want you to hold on to consciousness. In this picture, cannot itself be a physical system fully described by quantum mechanics. Because if it were, it would enter the superposition along with everything else. The observer has to be outside the chain of physical causation. The mind cannot be fully inside the physics. Now, von Neumann's interpretation has been challenged. Most physicists today work with interpretations of quantum mechanics that don't require consciousness to play a fundamental role. The many worlds interpretation, for instance, or decoherence-based approaches that explain apparent collapse without invoking observation. These are serious alternatives. But here's what's remarkable. None of them resolves the hard problem of consciousness. They may remove consciousness from the center of quantum physics, but they don't explain why there's experience at all. They don't explain what it's like to be the observer. The hard problem survives all of them intact. So we have this bizarre situation. The two most successful theories in all of physics, quantum mechanics, and general relativity are each, in their own way, pointing at a mystery about the nature of mind and experience that current physics can't resolve. And one of the most serious attempts to resolve that mystery, the one I want to spend the rest of this part exploring, proposes something radical, something that inverts the usual picture entirely. What if consciousness isn't produced by the physical world? What if consciousness is fundamental? What if experience isn't something the brain generates, but something the universe is made of? This idea has a name, several names, actually. In philosophy, it's called panpsychism, or in a more specific form, pan-proto-psychism. In physics, it's discussed under headings like the consciousness causes collapse interpretation, or integrated information theory, or in perhaps its most developed and provocative form, a framework proposed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff called orchestrated objective reduction, or OR. And before you dismiss this as fringe thinking, let me tell you who is taking it seriously. Roger Penrose is one of the most respected mathematical physicists alive. He shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020 for his work on black holes. He is not a crank. David Chalmers, who formulated the hard problem, has argued seriously for panpsychism as the most coherent solution to it. Christoph Koch, for many years the chief scientific officer of the Allen Institute for Brain Science and one of the most rigorous consciousness researchers alive, has publicly endorsed integrated information theory and its panpsychist implications. Philip Goff, a philosopher at Durham University, has written a serious, carefully argued book, Galileo's Error, making the case for panpsychism. These are not people who don't understand the science. These are people who understand it deeply and are following the argument where it leads. So what is the argument? The basic claim of panpsychism is this. Consciousness, or at least its most basic precursor, what philosophers call proto-consciousness or phenomenal properties, is a fundamental feature of reality, not produced by complex physical systems, not emerging from neurons, not something that appears when matter reaches a certain threshold of complexity, present in some minimal form at every level of physical reality. The electron doesn't have rich subjective experience, it doesn't have thoughts and feelings, but it might have some infinitesimally primitive version of experience, some minimal phenomenal property, some ghost of interiority. And as physical systems become more complex, as atoms combine into molecules, molecules into cells, cells into nervous systems, these primitive phenomenal properties combine and integrate into the rich, complex, unified experience that you and I have right now. This view has a history that's longer and more distinguished than most people know. Leibniz proposed something like it in the 17th century. Whitehead developed it into a full metaphysical system in the early 20th. William James, the father of American psychology, took it seriously. And today, under pressure from the hard problem, it's experiencing something of a renaissance among serious academics. Let me tell you why the hard problem pushes serious thinkers toward panpsychism. Because I think the logic is compelling, even if the conclusion is unsettling. The hard problem establishes that there's a gap between physical description and experience. Physical facts, even complete, perfect physical facts, don't explain why there's anything it's like to be a physical system. Now you have basically three options when you face this gap. Option one, deny the gap. Say consciousness is identical to physical processes, and the apparent gap is an illusion. Something about our cognitive setup makes us think there's more to experience than the physical story, but there isn't. This is a position some philosophers take. It's called type B physicalism or illusionism, but it requires you to accept that your most immediate and certain acquaintance with reality, your own experience, is in some sense an illusion. You have to say, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, these feel real, but they're not adding anything over and above the physical processing. That's a very hard bullet to bite. Option two, accept an additional substance. Say there's physical stuff and there's mental stuff, and they're genuinely different. This is dualism, the view most associated with Descartes. The problem with dualism is that it immediately raises the question of how the two substances interact. How does a non-physical mind influence a physical brain? How does a physical brain produce a non-physical experience? The interaction problem has never been satisfactorily solved. Option three, reframe the whole picture. Don't add a second substance alongside matter. Instead, recognize that our concept of matter, what we mean by physical, is itself incomplete. That matter, properly understood, already has an experiential dimension. That the physical and the experiential are not two separate things, but two aspects of a single, more fundamental reality. That's option three. That's panpsychism. And the argument for it is essentially this. It's the only option that takes the hard problem seriously without creating the interaction problem. If experience is fundamental, if it's woven into the fabric of reality at every level, then there's no gap to explain. The experience of neurons isn't produced by neurons. It's part of what neurons are. And if that's right, if consciousness is fundamental and not produced by the brain, then the question, where is your mind, gets a very different answer. Your mind isn't inside your skull in the way your liver is inside your abdomen. It's not a product of neural computation located in space like a physical object. It's part of the fabric of reality itself, instantiated partially and locally in the particular physical system of your brain, but not reducible to it, not contained by it, not generated by it. Your mind isn't inside you. It's something the universe is doing of which you are a local expression. I want to pause here, because I think it's worth acknowledging how strange this sounds. And I don't want to rush past the strangeness, because the strangeness is the point. We're in territory where our ordinary intuitions built up over a lifetime of navigating a macroscopic, slow-moving classical world are genuinely poor guides. Here's an analogy that might help. When Einstein developed special relativity, one of his conclusions was that time passes at different rates for observers moving at different velocities. A clock on a fast-moving spaceship ticks more slowly than a clock at rest. This is not intuitive. It contradicts everything our everyday experience tells us about the nature of time. And yet it's real. It's been confirmed by GPS satellites, by particle accelerators, by atomic clocks on airplanes. The universe turns out to be built differently from how it feels. The hard problem might be telling us something similar about consciousness, that the relationship between mind and matter is built differently from how it feels. That the assumption that experience is generated inside a physical system, that it's produced by neurons and lives inside skulls, is as wrong as the pre-Einsteinian assumption that time is absolute and universal. It might be the kind of wrong that requires an entirely new conceptual framework to replace. We haven't found that framework yet. I'm not going to pretend we have. The honest answer is that the nature of consciousness is one of the deepest unsolved problems in all of science and philosophy, and we don't have a satisfying solution. But here's what we do have. We have arguments, rigorous, mathematically serious, experimentally informed arguments that the conventional picture of mind as brain product located inside skulls is probably wrong. And we have the beginnings of alternative pictures that, while incomplete, take the problem seriously rather than dismissing it. In part 2, I want to take you deeper into those alternatives, into the physics of integrated information theory, into what Penrose and Hameroff are actually claiming and what evidence there might be for it, into what quantum mechanics might really be telling us about the relationship between mind and measurement, and into what I think is the most fascinating possibility of all, the possibility that consciousness isn't produced by complexity, but is instead what information feels like from the inside, which would mean that everything that processes information, every physical system, at every scale, has some form of experience, which would mean the universe isn't just full of matter and energy. It's full of mind. So we'd arrived at this genuinely unsettling possibility that consciousness might not be produced by the brain, but might instead be something fundamental woven into the fabric of reality itself. That the conventional picture of mind as a product of neural computation, neatly contained inside a skull, might be as conceptually inadequate as the pre-Einsteinian picture of absolute time. Now, the question you're surely asking yourself is, okay, but is there any actual science here, or is this philosophy all the way down? And this is where I want to spend time, because the answer is more interesting than most people expect. There are serious, mathematically developed, experimentally testable theories of consciousness that don't treat it as a brain product. They're controversial, deeply controversial. They haven't won the field. But they exist, they have equations, they make predictions, and some of those predictions are beginning to be tested in laboratories. Let me start with the one that has generated the most rigorous scientific debate in recent years. It's called Integrated Information Theory, or IIT. It was developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's the most mathematically precise theory of consciousness that exists. Tononi didn't start from philosophy. He started from neuroscience, from the clinical observation of what happens to experience when the brain is disrupted in specific ways. Here's the central observation that motivated Tononi. When you're in deep, dreamless sleep, the kind where no dreams occur, where experience is simply absent, your brain is still extraordinarily active. Neurons are firing. Metabolic activity is high. If you measure brain activity during dreamless sleep, it doesn't look dramatically different from waking activity in terms of raw neural firing rates, and yet experience is gone. The lights are off. So it can't just be neural activity that produces consciousness. There's something specific about the organization of that activity that matters. What's different? Tononi noticed something remarkable. When you stimulate the brain during waking using